Hey guys, this is Sarah from Hamilton. In the last lecture, we talked about the figure of Noah, and we talked about how the Bible presents itself and is structured according to its own internal logic as a series of concentric circles, where each concentric circle which follows expands the characters which came before. So you might think of this as working outwards from the center. And the central circle is the smallest, the shortest. It's just Genesis 1, 2 to 8, I think, or 1 to 9. I think I said Genesis 1 to 6. It's Genesis 1 to 9. It's the story of creation to the end of the flood and the exaltation of Noah. That's the first concentric circle. The next concentric circle you can think of as the story of creation. So all of these are going to begin with the story of creation because that is objectively the beginning of every single story. It begins with the story of creation and it ends with the offering of Isaac. Isaac's offering on the Holy Mountain is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Actually, we might probably extend it out to the description of Abraham's life immediately after the exaltation or ascension offering of Isaac. You'll note that I describe Isaac's sacrifice as an exaltation. Because that is theologically what is going on in almost every part of the sacrificial system. And the next one, and perhaps you could delineate additional circles besides these ones within Genesis itself, but the next one of the most obvious ones, is the story of creation down to the end of the book of Genesis. That is, the whole book of Genesis tells the story of the world. The next one, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you can just follow out the logic of these, and I'm sure you can infer the others for yourself if you have kind of a basic knowledge of the narrative of the Old Testament. But the next one after creation to Joseph is creation down to the end of the book of Exodus. This one, again, is particularly obvious because, number one, it is discernible just from the structure of the text itself, the beginning of the first book, the end of the second book. Just like Genesis, you could infer that there's probably a structure there if you believe in structures in general, the beginning of the book, the end of the book. But of course, Genesis begins with the creation of the world, the installation of Adam as high priest over that world, and Exodus ends with the creation of a new world. That is, the tabernacle has been constructed. And if you followed my material for any length of time, you know that the tabernacle is a miniature world. Again, I am not the first one to point this out. It is not original to me. It is not any evidence of some kind of unique insight. This has been pointed out by many commentators and scholars. The tabernacle's construction and dimensions are specified in Exodus chapters 25 to 31. It's specified in precisely 7 speeches, each of which begins with "the Lord said to Moses." So there's really no ambiguity about where one speech begins and ends. And each of those 7 speeches corresponds to a particular day of creation. And in many ways, those correspondences are quite obvious. For example, the 7th speech is all about the Sabbath. 6th speech is Bezalel, the tribe of Judah, is filled with the Spirit. It's interesting, let me just note here, that the person who corresponds to the creation of Adam, who is filled with the Spirit, just as Adam is constituted by the indwelling breath of life into the dust of the ground, the person who represents kind of a new or exalted Adam is of the tribe of Judah. So here we see one of the many subtle ways in which the Torah reveals the correspondence between the Messianic king and the figure of Adam. The notion of the Messiah as the last or final Adam is hardly something unique to Christianity and innovation of the New Testament, or even something that is absent from traditional non-Christian Judaism. You can find plenty of Jewish commentators, Orthodox Jewish commentators, who will speak quite freely about the fact that the role of the Messiah is the reparation of what went wrong in the fall of Adam. So this is not the place to go into all of that, but I just want to kind of sketch out this model with concentric circles and so on and so forth. Again, please do remember that if you have questions, you can email those questions to me at sarahfromhamilton@gmail.com, and we will begin the following lecture by discussing each of those questions. So most people have not emailed questions, that's fine. But if you'd like to, feel free to do so. So, concentric circles. I'm going to pass over those kind of intermediate stages between the Noachic story, so from creation to Noah, and the Joseph story, so from beginning of Genesis to the end of Genesis. I really want to focus in on the figure of Joseph and identify him in many respects as just a crucial paradigm for the Messianic king as the figure of Noah is. One of the reasons that this is canonically important in discerning the logic of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible as a whole, is that Joseph is, of course, an ancestor of the tribes of Israel. He's an ancestor of two tribes of Israel, the half tribe of Ephraim and the half tribe of Manasseh. So there are actually more than 12 tribes of Israel if you delineate each one independently. So there's 12 sons of Jacob, but Joseph is the father of two, and Joseph receives a special blessing due to the firstborn. The firstborn in Israelite law receives a double portion. So in terms of the nation, Joseph receives a double portion. He receives two tribes of Israel rather than simply a single tribe of Israel. So tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. But the significance of the fact that Joseph is an ancestor of tribes within the Israelite nation is that whereas the Israelite prophets will rarely make a direct reference to Noah, there are many allusions and indirect references and echoes of the flood story in the biblical prophets. I think the only direct reference in the prophetic literature is in, outside of the Chronicles, which includes him in a genealogy, is in the book of Isaiah, where God draws an analogy between the covenant that is made with Israel after the accomplishment of the suffering servant, who is the Messiah. In fact, the accomplishment of the suffering servant is said to bring about a fulfillment of God's covenant with David. So it's very clear that it must be the Messiah. But it also is said to fulfill and establish the covenant that God made with Noah. So the specific text I'm thinking of is Isaiah 54:9 and following, and I'm not going to read that text to you right now. It's beyond the scope of this present lecture, or outside its immediate scope. That's the only direct reference to the figure of Noah in the prophets. So using the figure of Noah as kind of the archetype of the Messiah is very useful, but you have to find it in terms of echoes and allusions and things like that in the literature outside of the Torah, indeed outside of the story of the flood itself. Abundant as those allusions are, it is perhaps more immediately useful, especially for one who is not deeply familiar with the language of the Hebrew Bible, to look at the figure of Joseph. Joseph is just as important as Noah in a literary sense because Genesis is the first book of the Bible, just as Genesis 1-9 is, in a sense, the first story or narrative of the Bible. So the first single narrative arc, and then the first book, which contains a multiplicity of narrative arcs. So, if Noah is the Messiah in Genesis 1-9, Joseph is the Messiah in the book of Genesis as a whole. Consequently, a great deal of messianic imagery in the Bible is going to accumulate upon the figure of Joseph, particularly in relation to the idea of the restoration of the tribe of Ephraim, or I should rather say the northern kingdom of Israel, which is often called by the name of its preeminent tribe, Ephraim, just as the southern kingdom is often usually called by the name of its preeminent tribe, the tribe of Judah. Ephraim is one of the half tribes that comes from Joseph. Ephraim is the preeminent son of Joseph, thus the preeminent tribe in the northern kingdom of Israel. So you do have in Judaism the notion of Messiah, son of Joseph, or Messiah, the son of Ephraim, and the regathering of the northern tribes of Israel is often linked with the illumination of the Gentiles, and the reason for that shouldn't be that hard to discern if you know the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph is about somebody who becomes a father to Pharaoh, someone who illumines the world of Egypt, and indeed illumines the entirety of the ancient world with the knowledge of God. So let's look at some more direct literary connections here as we discern the kind of inner point of the Pentateuch, as in what is the Pentateuch saying to us? We have to say it has one message. What is that message? Is that message obey Sinai? Is that message if you keep the Sinai covenant, you are going to possess the land forever? Or is the message something like the Messiah is going to come and circumcise your heart, bring the new covenant, and is going to make atonement for the sins of the world? So it's something like that last point, as I don't imagine surprises you, is my perspective. Anyway, let's look at some internal literary connections, what scholars call inner textuality as opposed to intertextuality. Inner textuality is verbal links between parts of a single book. Okay, so number one, the Ark of Noah is likened to Abraham's family. So within classical Christian typology, one of the most famous images is the image of the church as the ark. So remember what I said about the ark. The ark is a microcosm, a miniature representation of the entire creation. As a miniature representation of the entire creation, it grows and comes to encompass the entire creation. That is, everybody's alive today, at least everybody alive on the land, descends from Noah or from those animals that were on the ark. But the ark at one point was just a tiny, tiny slice of the world. It's placed on top of a mountain. It's placed in liturgical relation to God. And then everything which was on the ark and participates in its holiness, as it were, kind of grows out and expands to the ends of the earth. So now the whole earth is encompassed by the ark. Well, in the New Testament, the church is a representation of the destiny of the entirety of creation. So Paul says in the letter to the Ephesians, he says that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God is declared to the powers and principalities. That is, the many-colored wisdom of God, in which all creation was made, is declared through the church. All the nations are gathered together in the context of the church. The church expands out to fill the entirety of creation. I'm sure you get the point by now. That is part of the basis within the Bible for this traditional Christian image of the church as the ark, in addition to explicit analogies such as in 1 Peter, where the flood is analogized to Christian baptism. So here are the texts. This is Genesis chapter 8, the very end of the chapter. This is verse 18. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, all things that move on the earth went out by families. Now pay attention to that word, from the ark. And then it's followed. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered ascension offerings on the altar. Now, the word that is used here for families is actually used for the first time in Genesis in this passage, but it is used a number of times in Genesis chapter 10 and very significantly in Genesis chapter 12. So hold that thought for a second. So after Noah, so all the families of the animals come out of the ark. Noah then builds an altar to the Lord, and then he takes the clean animals and he offers them to God as an ascension. So those animals are turned into smoke and they ascend into the presence of God as the symbolic idea. Now, immediately after this, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth," so on and so forth. So you've got all these families, that specific word is important, are brought out. Then there is an altar built. Those families are placed on the altar and go up to God, and then God gives a blessing. Well, in Genesis chapter 12, the same kind of constellation of words is used, and indeed it is associated with sacrifice. So in Genesis chapter 12, we have God calling Abraham, at this point, Abram out from his own home country, and he makes him a promise. He'll make him a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Now, in context, saying that he will make Abram a great name inverts what the builders of the tower and city of Babylon said, which is that they were going to make themselves a great name. Every name that is a true name comes from God, is the idea. They can't make their own name. And even when they try, it ends up being an absurdity. They end up calling themselves confusion. In any case, God says this to Abraham, and then he says, "I will bless those who bless you, him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you will all the families of the earth be blessed." And in the near context, just a few verses later, in verse 7, we are told that God appears to Abraham and says, "To your seed I will give this land." And Abraham built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So there's an altar here. Abraham's story is going to come to its climax in an ascension offering, just as does the story of Noah. But the point here is that the families of the animals which proceed out of the ark and the blessing which follows on the ascension offering, which is offered to God, are associated by verbal connections with the families which will be blessed in the seed of Abraham. So already we have a connection which is implied between the family of Abraham and the ark of Noah. Moreover, the fact that Noah brought representatives of every kind of seed, the fact that Noah is said to bring representatives of every kind of seed onto the ark also connects with the story of Abraham, where the notion of seed is, of course, absolutely central in both a verbal and a thematic sense. And I will point you to the fact that Abraham plants trees in major places in the book of Genesis, and those trees are often associated with altars. If you listen to the preceding lectures, you know kind of what I'm referring to here in terms of the thematic importance of that. So the family of Abraham is an analogy, a kind of antitype to the ark. The ark is filled with all different families of animals who correspond in turn to the different nations of the world. And the ark itself is what elevates and consecrates them, lifts them up to God, purifies them, sanctifies them, so on and so forth. You have the idea God blesses a particular family, he exalts the name of a particular family, and then through that blessing, through that exaltation, all the nations of the world are blessed and exalted as well. Well, late in the book of Genesis, in the kind of final and lengthiest narrative arc of the book, you have, of course, the story of Joseph. And what happens here is quite fascinating, particularly in the way in which it is elucidated verbally. We are told that the famine, which came in the days of Joseph, came across all the face of the earth. Now, this phrase is quite interesting because it is used also in the story of the flood. In Genesis 8, verse 9, we're told that the waters of the flood came across all the face of the earth. And in Genesis 41:56, we are told that the famine came across all the face of the earth. Now, there are a number of reasons this is interesting. First of all, this is interesting given the mere fact of the correspondence. Given that we have been told that the family of Abraham is like an ark, given that we have been told that the family of Abraham is going to be a blessing to all the nations of the world in the same way the family of Noah was a blessing to all the families of the animals, it is interesting that this theme seems to be developed into the last narrative of the book, where you have a global catastrophe, at least one that is global in a literary sense, but the famine is quite widespread. You have a catastrophe described as global. It comes across all the face of the earth. And then the story of Joseph seems to be kind of the narrative climax within Genesis itself of the story of Abraham's seed. So Abraham was told he's going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Well, here you have, in the days of Joseph, all the families of the nations come to Joseph, come to Egypt to receive a harvest from him. So remember also what we said about the ark. Noah brings every kind of seed into the ark. Well, here Joseph brings a great harvest and gives that harvest to the nations. It's also interesting because of the contrast between the stories of Noah and the stories of Joseph, particularly in the mode of the judgment. The mode of the judgment, which is also, in a sense, a mode of redemption. Remember, every judgment is also a redemption. The mode of judgment in the first case is by water, and in the last case, it is by fire. That is, it is by a famine, it is by heat, it is by things which happen in the heavens. And this contrast, a first judgment by water and a second or last judgment by fire, is fundamental to the theology of the New Testament and indeed many threads of Judaism as well. So in the relationship between these two stories, we get to see the benefits of having this kind of pattern of concentric circles, because the biblical author, according to the place they are in the story of Israel, is able to create certain relationships among the smaller narratives within the text. So in the story of Noah, what you have is you've got creation, redemption, and glorification. But in the story of Joseph, the story of Noah is able to occupy its own distinctive place within that overarching pattern, which is very interesting, and it's quite important in terms of the relation between Old and New Covenants and all that kind of stuff. We also notice a few other things about Joseph, which make him an important figure in identifying the messianic theology of the Pentateuch. Joseph has the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, Genesis 50, verse 20 says, as Joseph saying to his brothers, you meant this for evil, God meant this for good. Now, what is he talking about? What he's talking about is he's talking about divine providence. And providence is it describes the way in which God rules the world. So God is always and everywhere ruling every aspect of creation from top to bottom. He knows every single causal interconnection among every particle of creation, small, large, and medium. Okay, so God runs the world with supreme wisdom because he knows it to its center. He knows everything about every bit of it, and he knows the way every bit of it relates to every other bit that allows him to govern things in such a way that he brings to pass his purpose without failure. Now, Joseph is able to discern the way in which God rules the world. Joseph is able to see the hand of God in the story of his own family and in the stories of the families of the nations, and thus say, God meant, or you meant this for evil, God meant this for good. Joseph has the knowledge of good and evil. And these are the same words used at the beginning of the story. And in fact, at the end of the Torah, we have the statement that God has set before Israel life and good, death and evil. So we've got the language of the two trees being associated with the Torah as a whole. So Again, we see this kind of structure of larger and larger concentric circles. The beginning of Genesis has knowledge of good and evil. The end of Genesis has knowledge of good and evil. The beginning of the Torah has knowledge of good and evil. The end of the Torah has knowledge of good and evil, so on and so forth. But Joseph is a figure who has the knowledge of good and evil. Adam sought to acquire that knowledge, but because his heart was not large enough to genuinely acquire it, he acquired death instead. Joseph's having knowledge of good and evil is quite significant for other reasons. For example, Joseph is dwelling in Egypt. It's quite an obvious statement to make, but according to Genesis 13, Egypt is like the garden of the Lord. And because the Bible is cumulative, we should keep that in mind as we proceed to events which are occurring in Egypt. Joseph goes to Egypt. He has knowledge of good and evil. And where is he ruling from? Well, he is ruling from the garden of the Lord. Moreover, Joseph is the person who has wisdom. Pharaoh says of Joseph, who is like this, who has wisdom from the Spirit of God. Now, the word for wisdom is not the same word that is used in Genesis 3 when Eve sees that the tree is good to become wise, but the concept is identical when we use associations like that in English as well, where words aren't etymologically related, but we recognize it's the same concept that's going on. And Joseph is, of course, a ruler. The fact that he is a ruler is important because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a tree of kingship. It is a tree by which Adam attempts to seize dominion over the entirety of creation. So as I belabored before, King Solomon says in 1 Kings chapter 3, that he longs for the wisdom to discern between good and evil. And what he's talking about is the wisdom to rule as king. And kingship is signified in garments. Kingship is signified in clothing. And Adam is given garments of death after he eats of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He tries to put garments on for himself. Also in the story of Joseph, we find that Joseph's garments are a massive theme. Jacob gives Joseph a coat of many colors, and Pharaoh gives Joseph a new robe. And we find that Joseph's coat is dipped in blood by his brothers, something which is going to come very significantly into play as we proceed today. Moreover, Joseph is someone who has life as well. Some scholars have argued that his Egyptian name, Zaphanath Paneah, means God speaks and he lives. That may or may not be true. That's quite, as far as I understand, quite an obscure phrase in terms of the Egyptian language. But in terms of more evident things, we find that in Genesis 45, Jacob's spirit had essentially died within him, but when he hears the news of Joseph's continuing to live, Jacob's spirit comes back to life. Moreover, in Genesis 41:38, we find that Joseph is described as having the indwelling spirit of God, and in Genesis 2:7, the spirit is the one who constitutes human beings as alive. So let me just read to you Genesis 41:38. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over all my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only regards to the throne will I be greater than you." So Joseph is ruler of the land of Egypt. He's king. He wears special garments. He has the Spirit of God indwelling him. He has the knowledge of good and evil, and he lives in a land which is like the Garden of Eden. Joseph is a last Adam in a myriad of ways. And note that he is not merely a second Adam figure, as if he goes back to the garden but doesn't progress further than it. Instead, Joseph, like Noah, is an exalted Adam. He has more than Adam did. Adam was naked, though innocent. Joseph is clothed in garments of glory. Now, what else is Joseph associated with here? Joseph is linked to the idea of the sacrificial offering. This is extremely important as we begin to discern the constellation of concepts which tend to be associated with the person of the Anointed One, the person of the Messiah. We will find with curious consistency that figures associated with the figure of the Messiah are often linked very intimately with the idea of representative sacrifice. So look at Genesis 37:32. When Joseph is thrown by his brothers into a pit and taken down to Egypt, his brothers have to convince their father that he has in fact died, or else, of course, his father is just never going to give up the search for his favorite son. So what they do is they take his robe and they dip that robe in the blood of a goat. And Joseph also travels to Egypt in a caravan of incense. Couple things which are highly important about this. First of all, goats are really important in the sacrificial system. You can actually have a Passover goat. As far as Passover is concerned, you can use a lamb or a goat. The only offering which actually requires a lamb is the offering that is on the day of first fruits, as far as I can recall. I might be mistaken about that. But on Passover, at least, you can use either a lamb or a goat. And Joseph's robe is dipped in the blood of a goat. Of course, in addition to it being important generically in the sacrificial system, well, you have it having central importance on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, you have a goat for the Lord, and you have a goat for Azazel, or for destruction, a goat which goes up to God, and a goat which is permanently exiled in the wilderness representing in horizontal terms what Sheol represents in vertical terms. So as you go upwards, you're going into the heaven of heavens. You go downwards, you're going down into the grave. Okay. As you go inwards, you're going into the Holy of Holies. As you go outwards, you're going out into the wilderness. So just think of the inwards upwards connection in these terms. So this goat, which goes permanently into the wilderness, is going into the grave. And the wilderness is called in the book of Revelation where Satan dwells. Of course, Jesus goes into the wilderness to fight with the devil. Well, Joseph is linked with a sacrificial goat because his garment is dipped in blood. And the idea of garment is, of course, massively important to the idea of Israel's priesthood. The garments of Israel's priests are very richly adorned. They're adorned both a plant matter and animal matter. The holiest garments are adorned in both. And these garments are associated with sacrificial animals. So just take, here's the earliest example. We've already talked about it. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, they eat the wrong food. They put on vegetable garments. God, in giving them hope, puts on animal garments. Cain and Abel. Cain, in offering the wrong sacrifice, offers vegetables. Abel, offering the right sacrifice, offers animals. So the link between garments and sacrifice is very close indeed. The fact that Joseph's garments are dipped in the blood of the very animal, which plays a central role in the Day of Atonement as well as Passover, is deeply important. The idea of a descendant of Abraham exercising sovereignty over Israel and the nations alike seems to be linked quite consistently with this idea of representative sacrifice. So, working backwards from Joseph, you see figure of Jacob. Jacob, of course, is a descendant of Abraham, and when he goes to his father Isaac to receive a blessing, well, what happens? Well, first he puts on skin of a goat. He puts those on his arms. He then presents his food to Isaac. Now, remember, sacrifice and feasting do not ever separate them. It is always a mistake to say, well, we're talking about feasting here rather than sacrifice. So, different topic, but some people will say things like the Eucharist is a meal, it's not a sacrifice. Well, that is completely absurd in terms of any sacrificial system that I'm aware of. Certainly in terms of the Bible, sacrifice and meal are super closely connected. In any case, well, he presents his food to Isaac. Well, just as Noah takes the clean animals, he offers them as an ascension offering to God. What does God do? He says, you can eat all of these guys. So Jacob presents his food to Isaac. Isaac presents him a blessing, and then what does Isaac do? Preceding the blessing, he smells Jacob's garments. Well, remember what was said about Noah's offering. God smelled the aroma of Noah's ascension offering and gave Noah and those with him a blessing. In the same way, Isaac smells Jacob. He smells and consumes his food, and then he presents Jacob with a blessing. Well, the important thing for our purposes is that when Jacob does these things, Jacob is wearing goat skins, goats being a massively important sacrificial animal, and something which is especially key in terms of Joseph. Take a look also at what is said about the figures who are linked with these representative sacrifices. So in Genesis 27, you have the blessing of Jacob. Let nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. Cursed be everyone who curses you. Blessed be everyone who blesses you. Observe here, cursed be those who curse you, blessed be those who bless you. Well, that just goes straight back to Genesis 12, 1-3. So this promise that is made about the seed of Abraham, or Abraham's family itself. In you shall all the families of the nations be blessed. And blessed be those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Well, it seems that these things which are said corporately about the family of Abraham are being focused down to a particular genealogical line. So here we have these things which are said about Abraham's family being said about Jacob personally. And this anticipates the language about Joseph. In Genesis 37, 7-9, Joseph has a dream where the various sheaves bow down to him. So that's the family of Jacob represented in the imagery of the third day of creation. And then his next dream is the 11 stars or constellations, I think, are bowing down to the star or constellation representing Joseph. So there's the family of Jacob in the imagery of the fourth creation day. And actually, this part of Genesis 37 is a recapitulation in literary terms of the entirety of creation week, beyond the scope of this talk, but you can work it all out if you just take those as your starting point. Third day, fourth day, and then work upwards and downwards from there, and I'm sure you'll see it. In any case, this language of your brothers bowing down to you in the context of a particular descendant of Abraham who is given dominion, that appears here, and it appears about the Messiah. So it appears in this blessing that Jacob gives to the tribe of Judah, a blessing where we'll get into this more as we proceed, but this is 49, 8-12. Judah, your brother shall praise you. Your father's son shall bow down to you. And then goes on. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff in between his feet until tribute comes to him. Him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And then in Numbers 24, both of which are two of these lengthy poems in the Pentateuch, which draw our eye to its central themes, this is said explicitly about the one who is a descendant of Jacob, the one who is going to exercise dominion over the nations. So the language that is used here of Jacob and of Joseph is associated with sacrificial imagery, and in these two cases it corresponds especially to the offering of a goat, which has clear implications in terms of the Day of Atonement. Well, an obvious example, Genesis chapter 22. Genesis 22, this is the Akedah, the offering of Isaac. Abraham offers Isaac as an ascension offering. Okay, in this narrative arc, this corresponds to the offering that Noah makes of all the clean animals of the world. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah actually represents another miniaturized narrative arc. I should have included that because you have a judgment by water, the flood, judgment by fire, Sodom and Gomorrah. There's lots of references to the flood story in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lots of really interesting stuff, none of which I'm going to get into right now, except to say that Abraham's offering of Isaac as an ascension offering is, as I recall, the only other reference to an ascension offering in the book of Genesis besides Noah's offering of all the families of the clean animals as an ascension offering. And this tells us something, because remember, what did we say earlier? We said that the families of the animals, which are offered as an ascension offering, correspond within the text of the book of Genesis to the families of the nations which are blessed in the seed of Abraham. And Isaac himself, an individual seed, is offered as an ascension offering. And then, what are we told? Genesis 22, verse 18. Let me just read the whole passage for you. Genesis 22, verse 16. This is the angel of the Lord, or Christ speaking. By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. So we have the blessing of all the nations of the world through Noah's activity. We have the blessing, or all the families of the animals, through Noah's activity. We have the blessing of all the families of the nations through Abraham's promise. And now we see the way in which these things are stitched together. You have this individual human being who is placed as an ascension offering on the altar, and in him will all the families of the nations be blessed. And then, of course, they find a ram who replaces Isaac. The ram is the most important sacrifice in the process of ordination to the priesthood of Israel. You can see that in Exodus 29, 15 to 32. The ram is also the most important sacrifice in the guilt or reparation offering, which in Isaiah 53 is the offering which is used to identify what the suffering servant does. So lots of really cool and interesting stuff is going on here. And remember that priesthood is fundamentally about access to God's presence. A priest is somebody who is consecrated to be near to the presence of God. That's the most important thing that they are. So the ram here that replaces Isaac is linked up with the priesthood of Israel, because what Isaac is an ascension offering. And an ascension offering means you're ascending up to the presence of God. So naturally, the ram is going to be the most important animal in creating the priesthood of Israel. But just observe here, the seed who is the Messiah in the largest sense. You have the seed, which is promised to the woman. That theme of seed is developed the book of Genesis throughout the Torah, throughout the Tanakh. Ultimately, it comes down to the son who comes from the line of David. And that seed promise is reiterated here in Genesis 22, particularly in relation to the offering of Isaac, which is then replaced by a ram. But it's really important for you to remember that according to the theology of the Torah, all sacrifice is representative, okay? All animals are offered as representatives of human beings. And I'm not talking primarily about animals taking the punishment which is due to human beings, as if, they take it so you don't have to. That's not what the sacrifices are fundamentally about. In the ascension offering, for example, the judgment is represented just by the death of the animal. Okay? It's not as if the sacrifice is over when you've killed the animal and you might as well kill it anyway. Well, the animal is killed. That's not the most important part. The most important part is it's divided, washed, and then burned. And that burning is an ascension. Turned into smoke, and that smoke goes up into the presence of God. Animals function the way they do because animals are genuinely analogous to human beings. I mean, this is why, you find certain structures in our bones, in the bones of most vertebrates, which are pretty consistent. They might be used in different ways, but this kind of five-fold structure that we find in our hands also show up in fish. They also show up in lots of other vertebrates. That's not necessarily an argument for common descent, as if it, just happened to be that way because our common ancestor ages ago happened to have that kind of five-fold structure. Well, these analogies that exist among a wide variety of animals, including human beings, have symbolic significance, and those analogies are the basis for the sacrificial system. If there's no genuine analogy, well, then animals can't represent human beings. So note again, just the specific way in which representative sacrifice gets consistently linked up to the promise of this seed who is going to crush the head of the serpent. You find again and again that it gets linked with references to this seed in which the nations will be blessed. You find again and again that it gets linked to this seed who is going to come from Judah and exercise dominion over the nations. You find again and again that the seed who is represented by the sacrifice is connected in a particularly intimate way to that sacrifice. So whose garments are bloodied in Genesis 37? It's Joseph's garments which are bloodied. Isaac is physically put up on that altar. All sacrifice is representative, but these figures get connected particularly closely to sacrifice, to sacrificial imagery. These associations, these promises, look forward to the nature and promise of the Judahite Messiah. And I say Judahite Messiah not because I'm trying to be fancy or unique or something, but because I'm trying to accentuate the point that these prophecies get focused through the tribal lineage of Judah. You find certain figures are specifically linked together with the prophetic language around the Messiah, and that pushes us to go look at these figures' lives and see what unites them, what holds them in common. And this nest of associations gets fully disclosed or revealed in Jesus. So to wrap up for this talk, I'm going to cross-post this talk to YouTube because I'm giving more lectures than originally intended. So I'm going to cross-post this to YouTube, and we'll continue this in the next talk. But to wrap this up, what I want you to notice is the fact that typology actually has a intrinsically prophetic dimension to it. That is, typology is a kind of prophecy. And it's a kind of prophecy which, when you discern its patterns, can actually be used in an argumentative context. That is, the biblical text itself gives us grounds wholly apart from the New Testament. You could make these associations and say these things prior to the coming of Jesus. The biblical text, through verbal links, gives us ground to focus on specific figures in Israel's history as uniquely typical of the Messiah. It gives us grounds to think the story of Joseph in particular has something to do with the Messiah. It gives us grounds to think that the stories of David and Noah in particular have something to do with the Messiah. And then when we start looking at what holds them in common, what they do, what their missions fundamentally are, well, that then gives us a kind of image, which begins out kind of blurry, but becomes increasingly clear and precise as you work through the Bible. An image which I think, when you focus on the Bible's own logic, the Hebrew Bible's own logic, begins to look suspiciously and remarkably like Jesus.